So hi everyone, I'm here with Chris Fitch today. And Chris, you're a vulnerability lead for Money Advice Trust, but also research fellow at the Centre for Personal Finance at Bristol University as well. So, but obviously you're well known, particularly in the UK, as being one of the experts in terms of vulnerability as well. I mean, a lot of the stuff that you've been doing has been very influential in terms of the industry here. So thanks very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
That's about, yeah. It's a small field, Chris. It's like being the best disco dancer in East Croatia. There's a few of us trying to do good, but it's very nice to be here with you as well.
I mean, I suppose just going back over history a little bit, I mean, you've been influential in the vulnerability world and some of the research that you've been doing. How have you seen that evolve over the last 10 years or even longer, it's like 20 years in terms of understanding interaction, the way we interact with customers? I mean, how have you kind of seen it evolve?
Well, it came to my consciousness that I've always been involved in working with people who are vulnerable to harm. As you know, Chris, my background when I was at the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Imperial College Medical School doing research on HIV and on policy around mental health, I was out with people in settings in the UK and internationally, and I know we're going to talk about internationally a bit later on, seeing people struggle with all the things that you might associate with a vulnerability to harm. And then just for a chance event, I ended up working with financial services 2004, 2005.
Wow.
I'll give you the short version, Chris. I was kind of
Yeah.
doing an ethnography, an anthropology of people with serious mental illness living in South London, Brixton. This was during the, not a credit crunch, a credit expansion. And so people with serious mental illnesses were getting credit cards. And one guy that I was with, he hadn't worked for like six, seven, no, he hadn't worked for 20 years. He was in his 40s, he had schizophrenia. And he ran up debts of £26,000 despite having an income of 6K. And I wrote about it in The Guardian, and someone in FS Financial Services picked it up and invited me to join a working group. Now, the reason for telling you that story is when I started working in financial services, into my consciousness came, oh, hang on a second. The things that we rely on outside of the welfare state or the NHS, or the way we think about vulnerability, it applies to these essential services: banking, energy, water, retail, delivery. There's all forms of vulnerability to harm that then intersect with these bigger issues. So in the last 15 years, while I've been working on financial services and essential services, I've been really kind of struck by how much change, and I do think we're just at the start. Maybe we can come to that a little bit later on. But I think a couple of changes that really struck me are how much work has been done inside the regulators. They're often these invisible individuals, like civil service heroes or house elves making everything work. It's been quite incredible, and I'm thinking about the FCA in particular, but other regulators also apply, about how much energy it's taken these people to push this through as a project. And I think that's the biggest thing I've been really struck by, because we had the economic crash of 2008, and then we had the response from different regulators in different ways. But it's not an easy task to take a project like vulnerability and keep it going. And the FCA, since 2014, they've been running this as a project, and we've come to the end of a review period over 10 years. We've had the vulnerability decade. I think that is quite incredible. And we underplay the fact we run a vulnerability academy of UK finance. And one of the things that's always struck me about our international participants from Australia, Norway, Spain, and beyond is how impressed they are by what we've done in the UK. There's an enormous amount that we have done, and we've got a great foundation. And I've been really impressed in the last 15 years. And this is also a challenge, we'll come on to this in a bit, by firms and staff taking on the things that they're being asked to do, and got to the point where we're now simplifying many of the approaches and tools that have been there for a while. So things like at the Money Advice Trust, we created the Texas disclosure tool way back for handling disclosures of vulnerability. And firms have really worked to improve, adapt, and even move beyond that. Or they've taken material from charities that called for X, Y, and Z, and they've done what charities often can't do. There are exceptions, and we'll get to them as well, and they've made it operational. So I think we've got this real kind of hallmark of maturity, but there is a flip side as well. Do you want to? So that's the good
Go,
side of
go
the
on, yeah,
coin.
give us the flip
Yeah,
side
do
as
you want
well.
a
Yeah.
bad side? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, for all the process improvements that we've made to the actions, and I know that yourself and others have been involved in getting firms to work in a more effective way around vulnerability, we still really struggle in measuring the impact or outcome of our actions. And that's a really limiting factor, I think. And we're working on this now at the Money Advice Trust. We've got David Atkins, who's joined us from Lloyd's Banking Group to work on outcomes, our outcomes specialists, and working on something very, very special coming up. But what we're not great on demonstrating as a sector, and I'm not saying just financial services, it's not just it is kind of working in energy and other sectors as well. We're not great on the real tangible difference that this makes to consumers' lives or our bottom line too. And, consumer research repeatedly shows that we're not delivering what consumers really expect. So I think we're in a great foundational place. We've done a lot of work. There's a huge amount we can do in the future. But the next big challenge, I think, will be outcomes. That's the one to really crack. I don't know what we think, Chris. I wonder why we haven't cracked this as well as we should have had. We've had a decade. Surely we should be able to do this.
I mean, what's been interesting for me has been how sort of like it's changed the culture, right? So the culture, particularly in the arrears management piece, I mean, it used to be very much around sort of like, it was around collecting money. It was much more of a financial kind of arrangement. And sort of, I mean, your point there around people taking the mantle on around sort of financial difficulties, but also vulnerability as well. It's changed the conversations we've kind of had with customers. And that's been quite liberating for many people in many firms as well. I mean, and the fact that people have taken that mantle and run with it, and it's like, well, I've got an opportunity to really help people out, really. And I think that cultural piece has been quite interesting, and it's been, I mean, it's been great to see in many ways. I think it's really been fantastic.
No, I mean, we have to say as a sector or as a group of people working around vulnerability, we do have a terrible institutional memory. I mean, God forbid that Peter Tutton or Kevin Still or Sarah Williams, the debt camel, get struck down at some point, because we don't often reflect or document how we've got to here, this moment. We sometimes reflect on, but it's often like we're kind of in a real right here, right now policy regulatory response kind of bubble. And I sometimes think that limits us on thinking, well, how did we actually end up here? But anyway, if you're talking about wider culture, I think there's two effects that we can see in operation here. The first is, right, we live in a society where people have been struggling for a long time economically, and not just economically, but with a host of other issues alongside, health and life challenges. And I think one of the really interesting things has been that for a whole host of reasons, firms have stepped into a space which was traditionally handled by government. I do some work with colleagues in Norway, and I hosted a couple of working groups coming over. But when they came over, one of their observations was, we don't really have charities. We see this charity work, it's been done by the state and by government. And we don't really, as firms, commercial operations, really enter into this territory. It's done by the government. Now, things are changing in Norway. Diana Peters, follow her on LinkedIn. She's embedded within a financial service provider. They are learning from us. I think that's a really interesting kind of cultural effect. The second cultural effect that I notice, and I both admire and worry about this, and I'm thinking about our vulnerability culture, is the loud voice syndrome. And that's where we have leading charities that really are pushing things forward. And I think they are doing terrific work. Money and mental health, the difference they've made has been, you can't underestimate it. Surviving economic abuse is another great example. We've got Scope working on utilities and disabilities. And I admire that work. I think it's absolutely fantastic to go check them out. But at the same time, I do worry that sometimes it overshadows some of the other issues where real harm is being kind of encountered. I mean, for how often do you go to a round table when you see a representative from sickle cell anemia charity? They're not there. It used to be learning disability as well. Kat Townsend at Nationwide and Project Nemo, Joe Dewar doing fantastic work there. But I do worry that sometimes shadows are cast over other issues. And this is why it's so important to look at common harms, things that are not just hooked into one charity, one driver of vulnerability, but across the piece.
Yeah. So the cultural piece is kind of interesting, though, in terms of like you're talking about loud voices there. I mean, how much do you think that sort of changed in sort of in our culture in terms of both in terms of, being more comfortable around sort of like flagging that I'm vulnerable as an example, but also then recognizing it as well. I mean, so I mean, has it really changed from 30, 40 years ago, or is it just that we're just more aware of it now? I mean, because there's that cultural kind of change that's going on as well, which I think has happened certainly within FS, but also within things like utilities. And you can sort of see it gradually changing, and it's sort of changing the landscape itself, because nothing works in isolation to a certain extent.
No, absolutely, yeah. So we do have this wider societal cultural change. Let's take mental health as an example of that. So when I was working at Royal College of Psychiatrists, lot to work around anti-stigma, around mental health, the Time to Change campaign. Claire Henderson Institute of Psychiatry evaluated that. Really, really interesting evaluation. I think that there's if I think about my daughter and her friends, I think about my younger colleagues, a real desire to create great inclusive spaces, to not just draw lines at what can and can't be done within organizations, but to change those organizations. And when you meet people on the front line, you must get this, Chris, when you're call listening or you're sitting in on a QA meetings or you're meeting people, they are driven to do things in a better way. And I think that's nothing but good. I think that the risk is sometimes that we struggle to get beyond the raised awareness element. So let's take the example of inclusive design. Now, no one's going to argue against inclusive design. It's like arguing against being anti-racist, anti-homophobic, or not loving ice cream. You know, no one's going to say, yeah, inclusive design, that's a terrible idea. But we get stuck in an awareness cycle where we get hung up on slogans like inclusive design. If we design for the edge cases or the periphery or with certain groups in mind, everyone benefits. That's a myth. Someone is always excluded from an inclusive design process, and it's better to be kind of transparent. It is not a magic bullet, but it's a fantastic thing to engage with. And I think what I would like to see is us to unpack some of these terms. If it's a real sign of maturity and a real sign of a desire from colleagues to make a difference, to unpack some of these things a little bit more, to slow ourselves down, to explore them.
Well, there's also the danger of like lowest common denominator there as well, which is, so you look at, maybe it's inclusive design, maybe it's like wording, I think, and you end up sort of like doing what is needed for the same for everyone, because that sort of saves cost, but that might not be the same for any individual. And it's like, it just feels like having one standard that's sort of the same for everyone. Is that the right thing to do versus maybe just having it much more personalized, so you're actually meeting the needs of individuals?
Yeah, I think it's having a sense of what you can do that is relevant. As a firm, there are boundaries to what you can do in terms of kind of meeting support needs. At the design stage, for example, is not just acting on good intentions and assumptions about what people need, but actually embedding and researching the needs of disabled or consumers who are vulnerable to harm. There's a great writer on this, Liz Jackson. She talks about the disability dongle, and it's this notion of the creation of products or services that sound good, but actually don't meet the needs of disabled people. She gives the example of shoes that were developed with haptic feedback, so people with sight impairment could go out and engage with the wider world without a cane or a guide dog or some form of assistance. And it was like, well, we don't need this because we have canes and we have guide dogs and we have assistance. So it's embedding in what people need. The second thing I think around support needs is sometimes we get stuck. We don't quite know. We want to help, but we don't quite know what it is that we can provide. And I think this goes back to this issue of kind of the louder voices. And sometimes we're aware, okay, hearing loops, coloured paper, ramps, taking a bit more time, being kind. Okay, these are things that we can do. But is there some wider guidance? It tends to be very fragmented, like a mosaic. You can't really get it anywhere. And that's one of the reasons that we pulled together a bit of guidance called Help, which is a mini support needs guide for the confused, where we looked across financial services, energy, retail, delivery, and beyond, and tried to bring it all into one place. So my advice to firms would be, when you're thinking about that question of vulnerable to what harm, and you're thinking then about that second question is supported how am I going to support the person? Try to crack your internal menu. Try to make it so everybody in your organization who needs to know can say, okay, I don't just know the top 3 lines of what we can do internally, but I've got a full sense of what that internal menu is. Imagine running a restaurant where you didn't have a menu and customers came in and they said, oh, right, I'd like something to eat. And you said, well, what would you like to eat? Well, that's the equivalent of asking, well, what support do you need? We need to kind of prepare for what people want, but we need to actually be able to kind of be very clear on what we can offer.
I mean, I suppose that comes back to data, your data point, but also listening to customers as well. I mean, particularly if you're in a customer service organization, you spend all your time listening to customers there, and like, how do you mine that data and find out what they actually want. I mean, it chimes to me a little bit sort of like we can sit around as the management team and come up with all these great ideas, but actually asking the customers around what they actually want and presenting it to them and listening to them and getting the data around that seems like a really sort of invaluable piece of feedback to kind of get around what those needs actually are as much as anything.
I think there's some great stuff like Three Hands, Jan Levy, Michael Hilton and the team there do some really great work on connecting to kind of the voice of the customer. Some firms run their customer Wednesdays and their customer Thursdays and they get people in to meet them. Absolutely. But we do need to also be aware, sometimes I think the voice that gets a little marginalized is that of a staff on the front line or on the design line. So on the front line, I mean, when I first came into this area of work, we did some research on the experience of frontline debt collection staff. This is back in 2017. It gave rise to our 21 Steps guide. And we also looked at credit provision staff. You can get a sense of what they are finding challenging because they are the ones who are having to operationalize and translate the principles of a global or departmental vulnerability strategy to take the training that they had and actually routinely, consistently turn this into a conversation. And many of the things that we learned there, we then said, okay, there need to be some tools or frameworks around this. So getting that balance in, if you're doing roundtables with charities, fantastic. But make sure on the other side of the scales, you're doing those roundtables with those staff who've got that pain point. Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the needs codes or the support needs, I suppose, which I think has been a really fascinating discussion. And this is me, I suppose, learning about it this year. I mean, it's been fascinating. It feels like the focus on needs and the move away from just vulnerability codes, I suppose, why people's got vulnerable to sort of like what they actually need. That feels to me much more like it's a maturity that's sort of evolving. Do you kind of feel that? I mean, it feels like we've moved forward. It's a big step forward to actually say, well, what do you actually need? What support do you actually need? And rather than you have this particular label, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So right back at the start, when this work around vulnerability came out, firms started recording, are customers vulnerable? Yes, no. Then we started thinking about drivers. So it might be kind of life events or financial capability or health or resilience. Okay, let's record that. Then people started working out, well, actually, I know that Chris is vulnerable. I know that Chris has had a life event, but I don't know what support he needs. So then we got some support being recorded in our data architecture, and that's absolutely fantastic. Some firms then started dropping the drivers or maybe the condition or the situation. But then we had the FCA and the consumer duty reminding people that maybe recording circumstance might be a good idea because you want to make sure the outcomes of particular groups of people vulnerable to harm are not lesser or as good as those who are non-vulnerable. So that was in the consumer duty. So the firms that are doing it well nationwide, I think, do it really well. There are many others that do it beautifully, but nationwide have started to collect a little bit more detail about circumstance as well as about that support need. But I think that the thing that we have to crack next is trying to standardize some of our descriptions of support needs, and for two reasons. Firstly, it just makes it a lot easier for consumers to understand what they're going to get and what they're not going to get. Dan Holloway at Oxford University, check him out, always says to me, Chris, it's not so much about what firms say they can do, but also about they explain what they can't do. So, and Dan's a disability activist and right, he's fantastic. The second thing is we have this thing coming up called smart data, which sits alongside all the data sharing efforts that have been taking place, which is about the portability of data. So I can avoid having to repeat as a disabled customer or customer in vulnerable circumstances what my support needs are, like time and time again. So I think we need to get a standard vocabulary or lexicology. Is that the right word, Chris? We need to get that in place as opposed to having a lot of variance. Doesn't mean that firms have to do all the support needs, just means we need to start talking about them in the same way.
I mean, I think it's interesting the support needs, it takes it from being almost like a company conversation about it's us and you are our customer. You belong to us as a customer, to being a customer centric conversation, which is what do you need? And you're going to tell us what you need and we're going to help you. And it flips it round for me in terms of like one way round to the other. And I think that's kind of an interesting sort of talking to a psychologist, but an interesting kind of like psychology or cultural kind of element you put across firms, which I think is kind of fascinating. I mean, the tell me once piece though, in terms of like you're saying, well, I want to have almost like a dictionary or lexicology I suppose, of like, these are what my needs are, and I'll be able to take that between different firms. That's the tell me once kind of approach that you're
Yeah.
looking at?
So the problem we're solving, and Dan Holloway sets this up beautifully. Dan is a like world intelligence champion. I think he's world creativity. He's on one of the teams that I work on. Imagine working with him. It's awful. It's so
Yeah.
intimidating. But Dan always says that, look, I don't just waste. Dan's got ADHD and bipolar disorder, and he has challenges processing information on telephone in real time. So kind of disclosing his support needs, particularly if it's inaccessible, takes a while. It can take him 2 days to prepare, work out everything that might be said so he doesn't get caught out. 2 to 3 days to actually make that call, 2 to 3 days to recover. But he says to me, it doesn't just happen once a year that I need to contact a firm and it robs me a week of my life. It happens 6 or 7 times a year. That's 6 or 7 weeks of my life absolutely wasted, where I could be doing something more meaningful. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. The TELUS wants, at the moment, we've got systems which are kind of online portals, and things like Support Hub from Experian is a good example of that, where you can share your support needs with multiple organizations in one process. But what's coming up, and I think it's going to be very, very useful adjunct to what's already happening, is the idea of digital identities, digital wallets, trust frameworks, where we can actually control how our information is shared with particular organizations so our support is needed. And I just kind of point one thing out. This isn't just about frontline knowing about people's support needs when they engage, but think about the aggregate data set as well, because we need to be designing with the needs of our customer base in mind. And I go back to my point right at the start, we need to be able to kind of also work out where we draw the lines in the sand, i.e., okay, this is what we're going to fold in to our inclusive design process to prevent harm, and this is what we can't do. Promising consumers the moon on a stick where you can't even offer them a choice of channels is not helpful. We've got to be realistic about what we can do.
And do you think there's a receptiveness in terms of that honesty being out there? Because certainly in the marketing world, I mean, we very much you're sort of like promising them everything, and you can promise people everything. I mean, but there is this sort of honesty around what you can do versus what you can't. Do you think there's a readiness for that?
I think sometimes when I hear people around tables and conferences talking about what they are doing, we don't get the warts and all version. And I mean, I come back from a scientific research background where you'd publish papers and you'd say what worked and didn't work. And there is a publication bias towards a positive result. So I think sometimes we don't get it all. That's what we do at the Academy. We try to unpack and kind of show where it hasn't worked. I think for a mature conversation, we have to actually kind of have almost like a catalogue of what did not work, a catalogue of failures. I think it used to be the biggest barrier to getting vulnerability projects working, if you go back a few years, used to be staff capability. And I think skills will always be an issue around making sure staff have those skills, both at frontline generic, but increasingly so around outcomes or inclusive design. I think sitting alongside that as a barrier is return on investment. And it's a conversation about, okay, we spent X time, X money on implementing intervention A, and this is the return on investment we got in terms of consumer outcomes. But also, and it's not a bad word, if it's a profit line you're operating, what was the impact on profit? If it's a surplus that you're operating, what's the impact on the surplus? Because there are going to be some firms who can't do this just because it's the right thing to do. They have to make hard choices between doing this or doing that. And I'd love to see, in the same way that we put in the bin that terrible 6-word phrase, we've always done it this way. I like the other terrible 6-word phrase to be, but it's the right thing to do. I'd like that to go in the bin as well. I'd like to have us move into a phase now. You may call me a dreamer, Chris, of where we look at return on investment and we're not shy to look at the costs and the benefits.
I mean, the aggregate data is quite interesting from a marketing point of view in terms of like, how do I design my products around what it will do, what it won't do, and sort of being upfront is quite powerful in some ways. And if you can do it up front, you communicate what it will do versus not, is quite powerful for customers as well. So like, actually, this will meet my needs and this won't meet my needs, I suppose. And that's where the marketing piece was coming from, because it's quite interesting kind of data around product design as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what's really interesting there is it goes back to your point about culture earlier on, Chris. And let's think about Monzo. I think they've got about 10 million customers now, Monzo.
Mm.
We've seen them grow at incredible rate. But think about the transparency that they operate with and the positivity it has generated. Take, for example, their gambling blocks. They wrote about them on their blogs, which customers engage with. And again, it's that cultural thing. Customers now, in many respects, will look at not only where their products do the most work for them, but also kind of an association of values.
Mm.
And I think people, it really resonated with people how transparent Monzo were about this. Even their announcement that they were going to do something around gambling got press coverage and
Mm.
plaudits even before they'd done anything. And I think that means that people will respect that openness and that honesty about where we're going to go with this. Because otherwise you have to wade through pages and pages to work out whether this thing is going to work for you or not.
There's also a little bit around sort of treating customers as grown-ups as well, right? So it's almost like, yeah, I mean, I might have some vulnerabilities, but I understand what you're saying, and I can go towards certain products, or I can look for certain services, I can express certain needs, rather than sort of having some of this stuff hidden in 6 pages. But that transparency enables you to have a much more grown-up conversation.
Absolutely. Imagine a price comparison website where you weren't just comparing on, you're looking at your travel insurance or a credit card, you weren't just comparing on product features, but there was an accessibility description for each of the products, what it could and couldn't do, and that may be in terms of the platform the operator operates under, or in terms of the card itself, does it offer a gambling block? Imagine being able to look across all of those products.
Mm.
I think first movers who start to do this, who start to really put their accessibility features front and foremost, are going to tap in to that. And they tell us it's 274 billion, the purple pound. I'm very
Mm.
curious about how they actually calculate that. But that's a huge market. There's a whole range of groups, whether people have learning disabilities or they're trans customers or they are D-deaf customers who are being traditionally underserved but still have pounds in their pocket. And firms are going to need to tap into that with that level of honesty and transparency.
And I suppose talk about implementation of some of these ideas, because even now you're talking about new ideas that aren't yet out there or sort of or being talked about. It's like, but aren't necessarily sort of on the floor yet. I mean, you talked a bit about organization and skills. I mean, what are the biggest sort of barriers for putting this thinking in now as we sort of sit today? I mean, is it technology, do you think, or is it thinking? I mean, how do we keep up with all this stuff that's going on?
There's a sociology, George Simmel, my background's in sociology, who wrote about how societies speed up
Uh,
as we evolve. But it does feel like a whirlwind sometimes. Okay, to break those barriers down, when it comes to skills, the biggest barrier, and it's something we work really hard on at the Money Advice Trust of our training and consultancy program, is teaching people practical skills, not just knowledge. In medicine, we have the Peyton method around teaching skills. It's something that we use at the trust. So actually giving people skills and then retesting those skills, like Elephants Don't Forget, we've got a
mm,
partnership with them. I think in terms of technology, I mean, I said at the start, we've got the foundation and I'm positive about what can happen next. We can build on this. One of the things I'm most excited about the possibility of is using AI, not just to augmenting frontline customer agents, but it's about simulating customers in vulnerable situations in training scenarios. Why let loose people who've been
mm.
trained on real people when you
Yeah,
can actually
yeah.
create safe spaces? I think AI has got a lot to offer more generally, but my message would be, look, we've got a great foundation. Some firms are still working their way up to that foundation, that baseline. The FCA are now focused on growth. Growth comes up in everything they say. Consumer Duty project is not over. I don't know about you, Chris. Sometimes I go to organisations and say, oh, our Consumer Duty project's coming to an end. You think, well, it doesn't quite work like that, I don't think.
Started.
The FCA are not shutting down. You
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
realise
yeah.
this, but
Yeah.
also in other regulated sectors as well. I think like Ofgem, for example, have got some really interesting work around their vulnerability guidance and a consumer confidence piece, which sort of mirrors the FCA's work. I think we're in a good place. Not perfect, but we're in an interesting position.
Well, there's certainly loads going on. You talked a bit about international markets right at the top there. You talked about
Right.
Norway, Australia, etc. How do you compare the UK versus other areas of the world in terms of like, the amount of knowledge we got here, the brain trust we got here versus looking out to other markets? And I suppose, what would you say to those other markets if they were starting to look at some of this stuff, both in terms of like vulnerability and some of the consumer duty type principles out there as well?
It's so we shouldn't kid ourselves. The reason that the vulnerability work kicked off mainly was the economic crash of 2008,
Yeah,
and the UK government, I think it was the coalition government, chucked the FSA onto the bonfire of the Quangos, set
yeah.
up the FCA and said protect vulnerable consumers and vulnerable consumers a bit more. So let's not kid. Regulation and law plays a real huge aspect in this. But what can they learn? Well, they can learn from the litany of mistakes that we've made over
Mm.
10 years. You know, you mentioned it, Chris, that focus on the driver as opposed to the support. And it seems so obvious now. It seems
It
so
does,
obvious.
yeah.
Yeah, it's they can do that. But I think what they could probably outstrip us on is maybe this return on investment. And we see a little bit of that within the fintech space, which I tend to think of as an international space. I read as much about American fintech as I do about UK. There are markets, there are segmentations that need serving. What's the return on investment, whether there are consumers who are vulnerable to harm or disabled consumers? What are people getting back? What's being saved? What's the impact? So that for me is really important.
I mean, how much do you think there's a sort of loyalty benefit, which has got hard dollars or pounds or euros associated as a result of just doing that, treating customers well as well? It's sort of like, and that's what I feel that it's changed the conversation internally with agents, it's changed the conversations with customers, and there's that loyalty benefit, even in the collections world, in terms of like, which was definitely a reticence I think people had before they started implementing it, but you do see it. I'm an advocate of it because I think you see it. It's better for the
Mm.
customers, it's better for your employees, and it's better for the bottom line as well in many ways.
So I asked a couple of my colleagues, Sarah Stevenson Hunter. I interviewed her for one of our very first podcasts on vulnerability matters around trans customers. I said, okay, when you all get together in the trans community, who do you decide to, because I imagine that's what Sarah does, who
Mm.
do you bank with? And she said, yes, we do have secret meetings
Yeah.
and we do have a favorite bank. I won't reveal who that bank is, but kind of people do go. Tim Scannell, who writes Profoundly Deaf, and he's a real leading voice on DDEF and financial services. He said, yeah, we know where to go, where we're going to be best served. So
Mm.
there's both a loyalty, but there's also a magnet effect.
Yeah.
People talk to
Yeah.
one another, particularly within communities, about where they're going to be best served. And I think we're starting to see organizations catching on. Cat Townsend at Nationwide, incredible work around learning disability and DDEF customers, trying to make this a little bit more mainstream. In the past, it'd been you might go here for this, you might go there for that. But I think we're trying to see some of this coming more into the mainstream than at the periphery.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think increasingly with the generation coming up and this generation as well, people will go to where they feel understood, seen,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
heard.
That's interesting. Well, very good. So where do you think we go from here? What do you think sort of comes next? I mean, you've talked a lot about a lot of new ideas actually in terms of like where we're going in terms of like single areas of support, transportability of data, those kind of things, transparency. Remember, what do you think's next on the horizon? What do we got to watch out for?
I think the thing that the thing to watch for, the acid test will be whether the momentum keeps going even when the regulatory pressure is perhaps perceived as being loosened a little bit. That'd be one test. The second test would be a recognition that no one individual firm can solve the problem of a consumer or a household. We know that consumers and households have multiple organizations involved in running their everyday life, whether someone's not vulnerable, or disabled. And I think what I'd love to see is just a little bit more collaboration and appetite for supporting projects that actually try to get different organizations
Mm.
working together to solve a problem. So the Tell Us Once example that we talked about earlier is a classic example of where we've got some leading early adopters trying to make this possible. We basically have the equivalent of a priority service register for financial services with Experience Support Hub. We have the priority service register for energy and water. We have the priority fault register for telecoms. And we know that the delivery sector is looking at accessibility. I mean,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be too hard to solve that as a problem. But what that requires, I think, is a little bit of government pressure. This government is focused on growth. I hope they see the link between attending to the needs of people who might be in a vulnerable situation or disabled and that huge bonus dividend premium in terms of making their lives easier and making them maybe a little bit more productive or even, God forbid, a little happier.
Well, Chris, thanks very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I mean, some fantastic ideas in there. So no doubt we'll watch this space. And I'll put links to all of the publications you got as well. You mentioned a couple here as well. So we'll make sure people get those out to people as well. So I do particularly like the needs one. So that was one of the more recent ones. So fantastic.
Absolutely, it's like my school report. Chris, you have some fantastic ideas. Make sure you do them. It's kind of but yeah, no, thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much.